I'm back in a minute.
Yeah, sure. So welcome everyone. We're waiting a bit for everybody to get into the webinar, and we'll get started in a couple of minutes. Welcome everyone. I'm just going to give it one more minute and then we'll get started. Okay, it's 2 minutes past 7 on my clock, so I guess we'll get started. Welcome everyone, good evening. It's very good to see that you're here tonight. I hope everybody's doing well in their respective bubbles in good health. Tonight we'll have a discussion about armed drones. My name is Merel. I am the Officer for International Security and Disarmament at Pax Christi Vlaanderen here in Belgium. And as such, in collaboration with our partners Vrede, VZW and the European Forum on Armed Drones, which is supported by PAX in the Netherlands, we're organizing this webinar, and I think we're all very excited to hear what the discussion is going to bring. Before we start, maybe I propose to explain a bit the house rules. So I've seen in the chat that some people are asking about buttons to unmute. So this is a webinar, which means that all participants or all attendees, their mics and videos are turned off. If you have a question, we're inviting you to put it in the Q&A button, which is if you hover with your mouse over the screen, you'll find down a button that says Q&A, and there you can leave your questions and we'll come back to them after the speakers finish their presentations for a discussion. So each speaker will get 10 minutes to elaborate on their perspective. The chat is also available for communications. If you have any questions, technical or other, you can raise them to my colleagues Thomas De Weer and Emmeline Lievens. You can ask them directly in the chat or privately to them. This webinar is recorded and we're live on Facebook, so that's also very great. So for the people who are just tuning in, welcome as well. Tonight we're holding a webinar on new military technologies, more specifically on drones. So I think everybody has seen recent events going on in Nagorno-Karabach, in Armenia and Azerbaijan. The conflict in northern Syria has been very present in newspapers as well. The conflict in Yemen and Libya as well. And I think we've all seen that the proliferation of drones poses very important questions, and we're hoping to be able to answer some of those tonight. Over the summer, UN Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial killings also raised some questions and some concerns with regards to compliance with international humanitarian law, international human rights law. And she was followed in those concerns by international experts as well as civil society. Now today, Belgium has acquired 4 MQ-9B drones. Those are the very famously known Reaper drones. For the moment, Belgium has acquired those drones unarmed, but the possibility exists that those would be armed in the future. Former Minister of Foreign Affairs Goffin mentioned during a session in the Commission of Defense in September 2020, so quite recently, he mentioned that this decision would be taken by the next government. We finally have the next government, so we're really curious what their decision will be, and that's why we find it important tonight to get to the political, ethical, legal questions that are raised by arming these drones. So we have invited 4 speakers tonight. The first one who will be speaking is Maaike Verbruggen. Maaike is a doctoral researcher in military innovation and artificial intelligence at the Institute for European Studies at VUB. She specializes in emerging military technologies, military innovation, arms control, and disarmament. And she will help us better understand how the development and use of armed drones has impacted the way wars are fought and the implications this might have for compliance with international law and preserving peace and security. So Maaike, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you everybody for coming. So as the first speaker, I will start with a few introductory remarks about armed drones. I'll present a very short history. I'll talk about the different types of armed drones, and then start the discussion on whether the problems of armed drones lie with the technology itself or its specific uses, and the conceptual fuzziness of drones as a technology in between munitions and platforms. I'd like to also note that I'm talking about remote control drones here. I'm leaving aside the question of AI and autonomous weapons, as that's a wholly separate discussion, for the issues are frequently conflated. The SkyGuardians are not autonomous, so let's focus on drones today only. But let's start at the beginning. So while we might think of drones as a new technology, they actually have a very long history. In the First World War, the first experiments started to develop flying torpedoes. They were not so successful, but over time they developed into intelligence gathering drones used in the Second World War in Vietnam, in Bosnia. The first ARS drone, as we know it, was developed in autumn 2001, not long after 9/11, as the US wanted a technology that could quickly take out Osama bin Laden as soon as he was spotted. So present day, there are many different types of armed drones. So we have medium altitude, long endurance or MIL drones, like the Predator and the SkyGuardian. These are large drones that can fly great distances over long times. They're therefore used for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, or ISR, and they can also be armed and used for bombing. They're mostly used in more asymmetrical warfare against militarily weaker countries and non-state armed groups, like the French do in Mali, as these drones are quite vulnerable to air defense systems. But that's not the only type of armed drones. A more common type is actually the tactical drone, which is much smaller and can fly a shorter distance. You use them in close air support or attacking enemies closer by. These are the type of drones we see in the war Ukraine right now a lot. Another type of armed drones are small, commercially available drones armed with explosive devices. They have been used, for instance, by non-state armed groups like Hezbollah. You strap a bomb to a drone and you fly it into the enemy. These are sort of the aerial equivalent of a car bomb. Another type of armed drone is the loitering munition. In these, an explosive is built into the drone and it flies into the target and self-destructs. So you have two types here, small ones that fit in your backpack. You take it out, you use it to take out an enemy in more closer proximity. The other type is much larger. These loiter for a long time in the air until they find a target whose radar signature matches their assignment and they zoom into it and they self-destruct, like in a kamikaze attack. We've seen these for the first time on a large scale in the recent conflict in Nagorno-Karabach. So considering all these different types of drones, most of our discussion will be on the male drones, but it's important to keep in mind that there are different types of drones and they all have different implications for peace and security. So let us now get to the debate on drones. So a fundamental question in a debate on armed drones is how to view drones. And the point is here whether we should think of drones as just an aircraft without a pilot, or whether they enable a new type of warfare, or whether the problem is more specific uses of drones that might violate international law. On paper, drones might not be very different or more problematic than manned aircraft. But especially male drones can enable new types of missions or changes how countries conduct them. A country flying a drone will have less risk of their pilot dying, which might decrease political risk for governments to conduct a mission. It might decrease emotional distance between combatants in warfare, making soldiers more likely to strike when they would have not done so otherwise. But also note that this is still the discussion, and there's also evidence that drone pilots get PTSD at similar rates as fighter pilots. Drones also make the level of risk between the warring parties more asymmetrical, especially in those cases where the pilot is safely flying the drone from their home country. For instance, the Taliban notably call drones a coward's weapon for these reasons. Like this asymmetry has implications for just war ethics. It's also important to realize that as Western militaries become more untouchable, the people they fight might seek out and attack the only targets they can actually reach, like our civilian populations. Finally, countries are less likely to escalate violently when drones intrude into their airspace, although this might change in the future as drones become more commonplace. So that brings us to the question whether the problem is with drones or their use. Using a drone which otherwise uses F-16 while at war is not per se problematic, as long as it complies with international humanitarian law. But the problem is that especially the USA has conducted drone strikes in a large scale in countries it's not at war with, like in Yemen and Pakistan. These strikes often involve assassinating someone they suspect of terrorism without a trial, which violate international law. A lot of these killings have also been done by the CIA, which is not a military but a civilian agency without the same ethical and legal training, and with little transparency and accountability about who they killed and why. Moving on to the last problem. You might have noticed when I set out the different types of armed drones, it's not always clear whether to think about them as munitions, like for instance missiles, or as platforms like aircraft. Especially loitering munitions are a mixture of both of these. And as they gain more autonomous functions, this conceptual fuzziness will only continue. Like this is important because international law relies on these categories in certain regimes as set by existing weapon systems. For instance, the Missile Technology Control Regime It's an export control regime to regulate platforms that can be used to carry weapons of mass destruction. They classify drones as missiles. But is this really the best way to think about drones? In the naval domain, should we think about an underwater armed drone more as a sea mine, a torpedo, a submarine, a vessel, a ship, a warship? Like, this classification matters because it determines which uses are legal and which not, and under which conditions, especially in peacetime. So to conclude, let me repeat my key takeaways here. So one, it's important to distinguish between the debates on autonomous weapons and drones. Tonight we're talking about drones, because both these systems have very different sort of implications, and they're often mixed up in the debate. Two, there are many different types of armed drones, and they all have different implications as well for peace and security. So it's important to distinguish between them and be precise what you're talking about. 3. A key problem for the discussions on drones is whether the problems lay with the drones themselves, the new missions they might enable, or their specific uses, and whether this complies with international law. And 4, drones are conceptually fuzzy, so to say. Some are in between munitions and platforms, and this will only get worse probably in the future. And they therefore do not always fit neatly into our existing regulatory categories. And that about sums it up. I would be glad to talk more about this in the Q&A, but now let's move over to Colonel De Decker and discuss the Belgian case.
Thank you, Maaike. Thank you for the very clear overview on drones. I heard you say there are very different types of drones with different aspects and different implications for peace and security. And I'm very happy to welcome Colonel De Decker. He's with us tonight as Chief of Staff of the air component of the Belgian defense, and he will be explaining us more about the new acquisition of the SkyGuardian-drones by Belgian defense, and thus we will go more into the male drones. Colonel De Decker, the floor is yours.
Good evening. I hope you can see and hear me. My name is Geert De Decker. As said, currently Chief of Staff of the Air Force, but a younger version of me was an F-16 pilot, and while doing that, I participated in a couple of operations. And afterwards, I also was involved in different operations in Libya and Iraq as being a red card holder. And the concept of red card holder is something that Belgian defense uses to support its pilots in determining whether or not a potential target that they're asked to engage is within the mandate and within the law. And it is in those functions that I worked with different types of drones, not only Belgians, but coming from the coalition. And one thing I learned is that between Libya and Iraq, there was about 5 years. And when in Libya, we had about 4 drones, I think, that were circling over the whole area, which is about 10 times Belgium, or maybe, I think, even bigger. So as a red card holder trying to support your pilots, you had very little information coming directly. You had some information, or a lot of information, that was gathered on the ground from human intel and from recce flights, but almost none near real time, which was totally different when we worked in Iraq, or working in Iraq, where there is a multitude of drones, where almost every ground movement is covered by drones. And so you have a long dwell time, a lot of full motion video. So you are able to build a better picture on what is happening on the ground, which will allow you to discriminate between enemy fighters, friendly fighters, and civilians. And so making the engagements more correct and reducing the risk of collateral damage. So in the past, Belgium had some experience with drones, the tactical drone, which was the Bee Hunter, until this summer, actually, when it was decommissioned, which was a tactical drone which was used or could be used to about 100 kilometers from its ground station, and which was actually just the local commander's monoculars or binoculars on an extension of those. And now with the MQ-9B, we are entering a totally different area, and I will try to give you some picture on the MQ-9B. I hope you see that. So the General Atomics SkyGuardian MQ-9B is, as said, a male, medium altitude, long range, and exists our system. It's not the Reaper. It's actually a much better version of the Reaper, and I'll tell you why in a moment. The system we have acquired is actually 2 ground systems and 4 aircraft. An aircraft, the span of an aircraft is about the same as a Boeing 737, so it's a pretty huge aircraft with a length of 12 meters. And the most important thing that we can do with this aircraft is that it can loiter more than 40 hours, which means that you can first store it or operate it from an area which is behind the enemy line, well, not behind the enemy lines, but on the safe side of the enemy lines. So and then you can have it fly towards the area, and it can stay there more than 30 hours, gathering a lot of information with different sensors and sensor suites that are modular and can be tailored to the mission. It has enormous field capacity, of course, and it has, as mentioned before, some hard points under the wings where you could eventually hang some weapons. For the moment, as it has been stated, we don't have those weapons yet, or actually we have weapons, but they are used by the F-16, and there is no intention yet to use them on the MQ-9B, and as stated, that is going to be a parliamentary decision. That being said, let me see if I can undo this. Why is the MQ-9B so different from the Reaper, and why did we buy the MQ-9B? That is because we wanted to use it in worldwide, in areas not only over enemy territory, but also in Belgium for training or for support to other federal entities. And to be able to do that, it has to follow certain civilian rules, mainly about safety and about the way it is constructed, the way it is redundant, the way it talks, the way it determines where it is. And so actually you can think of this SkyGuardian as a normal civilian plane with all these safety features like radios, like IFFs and all that, so that ATC controllers can talk to it as if it was a normal airplane. Also, the construction is much more robust than the earlier drones, even the Reaper, where there was actually a concept of, okay, if we lose it or it falls down, no big deal because it will fall in enemy territory. That's not the case for Belgium. We try to keep our stuff alive and flying. What will it allow Belgium to do? Like I said, whenever we go into a crisis, we always go as a coalition or together with other countries. Which means that within this coalition, we are but we are participating most of the time with our F-16s. But in order to engage those F-16s, you need a lot of information to make a good picture of what is happening on the ground and to be able to decide whether or not you're acting in accordance with all the laws and the mandate. And for that, you need information. And we've learned that a drone is a valuable tool to gather a lot of information and collect signals, pictures, and live video. With that information now, we can go to the coalition as well. We can participate, and it will allow us access to much more information, and it will allow us much safer or more underbuilt engagements. Will we deploy? When will Belgian Defense deploy? Well, it will be the same as we deploy our F-16s or other assets. That is, we will propose to the government a certain participation with a mandate, and that will be discussed in government and will be proposed to Parliament. And with that approval, we will use our males as we would use our F-16s. Initially unguarded, but even in the future, unarmed, sorry, but even in the future, if they would be armed, that would be with the same mandates and the same rules of engagement as we would do with our F-16s, and with a red card holder who would be present or following all operations, so that we are sure that we stay within the mandate. With that, I'll leave it to that for the first intervention, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this elaboration on the new drones. Then we'll head over to Lode. Lode is our third speaker. He's a professor at the Institute of Philosophy and Ethics at KU Leuven, and he specialized in ethics when it comes to technology and artificial intelligence. And as such, he often gives ethics classes to engineers. And soon he will also be publishing a book on philosophical perspectives on technology and AI. And tonight he will be highlighting for us some moral and ethical questions we should be asking ourselves, our politicians and our military forces as well, before arming drones. So Lode, the floor is yours. I'm not sure you unmuted yourself.
Okay, sorry.
No worries.
Okay, thank you for inviting me and also for the introduction. So I don't need to introduce myself anymore. So I'm teaching philosophy, ethics of technology and AI, and my research is focused on military ethics and AI, and more specifically on killer robots. There are a lot of things that we can say about robots, about killer robots from a more ethical point of view. I only have like a couple of minutes, so I'll say a couple of things that I believe, I'm not sure, but I believe that are important for the first step of ethical debate, discussion on robots, on drones. First thing that I want to stress is that if you decide to defend the prohibition of drones, you should always keep in mind that the prohibition of the use of drones is only one of the several options that you can take, positions you can take. It could be defend that it should be allowed, and then if you believe that should be allowed, you have two other possibilities. You go for an all the way option or a more regulated option. I believe nobody would really defend that topic or that position, but we should use it. It should be obliged for a state, for a group, for a society to use drones. I think the regulated version is the most appealing version, at least in my eyes. If you decide to prohibit the use, the development, the creation of drones, still it can take different forms. Yeah? There can be a discussion whether or not the prohibition of drones should be regulated in a legal way or an extra legal way. Okay? Meaning that if someone uses drones, if you believe it should be prohibited, and if someone uses or produces drones, then he or she needs to go to court and can be punished by the state, by the government, or whatever. That's the first option. And if you believe that that should be the option, the first possibility is that the existing legislation is sufficient to meet that requirement. But it's also, of course, possible that the existing laws are not sufficient and that we have to fill a gap. And as we all know, of course, filling the gap in the existing law can take a while. We know that regarding the technology of landmines, it took us years to prohibit these technologies. But at that point, so in the gap between deciding that it should be prohibited on the one hand and filling the gap in the existing legislation, we can rely on non-binding moral codes that, in a sense, replace the existing or replace the law up until the moment it really is implemented, this new law. It's only temporarily that we use or that we rely on moral codes. A second option is that at the end, we believe that it's a bad thing that it can be used. If you believe that is the position that needs to be defended, that's a bad thing. But we have a second option, is that it should be regulated in an extra legal sense, meaning that we rely on non-binding moral codes that take a specific place in society. It's a kind of additional role, regarding the existing law. So you have the law that says you cannot do this or that. And regarding drones, you could say that, okay, it's a bad thing that we produce it, that we make it, that we use it. But if someone uses it, we believe it is a bad thing, and the use should be regulated by non-binding moral codes. It should not be punished by the government. The third thing is that if you believe that it should be prohibited, you of course should have very good, strong, powerful arguments. More precisely, special reasons. And you should explain to me, you should support the thesis that it should be prohibited, referring to an argument that explains me why this specific technology, namely the drone, should be prohibited, and other technologies, other weapons, should not prohibit it. So you need to search for a very good, solid argument for your thesis. That argument should really be should be an argument. You cannot rely on emotions. I do not feel comfortable about drones, about killer robots, etc. It doesn't belong to my worldview, and my intuition says that a killer robot or a drone is something that is bad. Of course, that is. I can believe that, of course, and it's pretty human to have these kinds of reactions regarding killer robots or drones, but they are not sufficient for a moral debate, a moral discussion. If you believe you have a good argument, that argument should not include the conventional weapons. For example, often referred to the bad use of a drone, then it could be an argument against the drone. Of course, that is not an argument, since all weapons, since all technologies in general can be misused in a morally bad way by a terrorist, for example. So referring to the morally bad misuse of a technology is not a sufficient argument. And if you have an argument that also includes the use of conventional weapons, then at the end, it means that you argue against all weapons in general. But that's, of course, going against the intuition of a lot of people. And you may do that, and I would like to hear that. But it should, again, be a very good argument. Last thing, if you defend the idea, the thesis that we should prohibit drones, you should, of course, take into account the benefits. First of all, it's the technical benefit that is very precise. And again, that the consequence of this technical advantage is that fewer civilians will be killed and there will be less collateral damage. That's at least the promising advantage of a drone. Your own soldiers of your own army, there's a lower risk. They don't have to fight the battlefield, etc. Consequences, greater chance of victory. There is a promise that a lot of people will support more humanitarian interventions, since no soldiers will be lost. And again, the promise is also that this kind of war that uses drones is cheaper, meaning that you have more money for other things. I'll focus, that's the last part, I'll focus on 3 arguments against the use of drones, more or less moral arguments. And one of them is that if you use drones, if you kill people with a drone, then your action is disrespectful regarding to the victim that has been killed or harmed by the drone. It's not consistent with the dignity that every human being deserves. It reminds me of a very famous argument against other weapons, but not drone. The crossbow is immoral, and that made warfare into a depersonalized and dishonorable point-and-click affair. It was about the crossbow. You could say the same about the drone. And of course, there are differences. And of course, we know that being killed by a drone or being harmed by a drone is something disturbing and bizarre. And of course, we understand it. But at the same time, there are at least 4 problems with this argument. We often refer to the idea of dignity and respect. But if you believe that is an argument against something, you should be able to very clearly explain to me what dignity and respect really mean. If you're not able to do that, that cannot be an argument. In my opinion, the idea of dignity appeals to my intuition. We are not able to define what it is. Second problem, what is the difference with a tank on an airplane or a helicopter? If you use a helicopter or a tank on an airplane in order to kill a human being, why would using this technology be more respectful than using a drone? And if it would be the case that the use of drone expresses a lack of respect regarding the victim, would that be a sufficient argument against the use of a drone? Second argument, it lowers the threshold for wars. Well, that's related, of course, to the advantages of drones, namely they are cheaper, would lead to less civilians that will be killed, less soldiers that will be killed, and so there's a lower threshold. Of course, that's possible, but that's not necessarily the case. Okay? There are a lot of technologies, military technologies that are used, the recent history, and even though that's the case, and even there was a lower risk that your soldier will be killed when he or she uses this kind of technology. At the same time, that didn't lead to countries going easier to a war. First objection. Second, going to a war, if you decide that the country will go to war, in a war, it will start a war, we have a lot of concerns, a lot of arguments that are taken into account before you reach the conclusion. And one of them is the risk of killing, but another is the risk of a counterattack. And a counterattack can lead to destruction of the civilian infrastructure, for example, or the death of a lot of civilians. So even though it would be the case that there is a lower risk, that of course wouldn't necessarily lead to the situation that we go to war easier than without the use of drones. Second argument, or third argument, moral argument, is that the use of drones would be unfair. That's often heard argument against the use of drones, and can also kill robots. First, it's not 100% clear what it really means. And often we can distinguish 2 interpretations of this argument, is that not all parties that participate into the conflict situation have the financial means to use those technologies and robots, killer robots, drones, etc. It's of course a pretty weak argument. If the technology is rather cheap, then everyone is able to buy the technology, and that of course makes that the argument loses its capacity to defend the thesis. Second objection is that there are a lot of weapons, a lot of technologies are very expensive, even today, and cannot be bought by countries, groups, societies, and at the same time they are not forbidden. Second interpretation of this third argument could be that the victim is not able to defend him or herself. If that would be true, and again, it is true, but again, it would be a problem since soldiers cannot defend themselves against machine guns, aircrafts, etc. So if that would be an argument, and a decisive, conclusive argument against drone, then we should also forbid or ban aircrafts, machine guns, etc. So at least 3 problems with this third moral argument. Small conclusion, I'm not arguing pro the use of drones. What I did the last couple of minutes was not arguing pro the use of drones. I'm only was saying that the arguments given to support the idea that we should not use drones are not sufficient. We can, of course, find develop arguments against the use of drones, but not these ones. Not these arguments, not the argument referring to unfairness, respect, or lowering the threshold. But I think if you would like to defend the prohibition of drones, you should think more and find more decisive, powerful counter-arguments. Thank you.
Thank you, Lode, for this presentation. And then lastly, I would like to introduce our last speaker, Yannick. Yannick is the director of GRIP, which is a research institute on peace and security here in Brussels. And he has ample experience doing research on international security, arms control, strategic, economic, and industrial dimensions of armaments. And he has a lot of experience with research on drones. And he will give us his perspective on the claim that drones can be a tool for more effective and more clean wars. Yannick, the floor is yours.
Yeah, good evening, everyone, and thank you for your invitation. When you speak the last on the panel, you think that everything has been told already, and my task is to summarize or sum up some of the ideas over there. But I've been surprised by the presentation somehow, because I agree with a lot of the things that have been told, but I'm maybe going to adapt my presentation to put the emphasis on where I think I could to some extent disagree, just to make a debate out of it. So there was a couple of questions in the presentation on the preparation of this webinar. I've been asked to think about the impact of 15 years of using armed drones in conflict for civilian population. What are the dangers of armed drones for civilian protection? And does the use of drones lower the threshold for the use of forces? So, okay, why not? I'm going to come back to these questions at the end, mainly to say, spoiler alert, that I don't have the answers to that, and I doubt you can have an answers to this question, and I will tell you why. So, if I come back, what I want to enlighten, start to say is drones as a technology has once been discarded by the military itself. Not reliable, not trustable. You cannot put the decision you cannot create so much distanciation between the decision to collect some intel and obviously to kill people. So the military itself originally discarded this technology based on these assumptions. So what has changed? Because all along the global war on terror, it became a desirable addition to the armed forces, an asset to the most advanced armed forces first. And why? Because quite basically, it provides better intel. It's quite reliable on the battlefield. Soldiers have seen that, and surprisingly, we have Air Force commander here to talk about the Reaper and so on. But surprisingly, maybe smaller drones, the one you can carry yourself, like the Raven or the Scanigo and so on, maybe I've helped more than the Predator to legitimize drones overall as a capability or an asset for their armed force. And this led to the idea that maybe we're not a push button war yet, but at least with the use of drones and armed drones, you are closer to a cleaner, if not a clean war. That's from the perspective of the operator. And I've heard a lot of mentions about that. You know, you are very specific and precise with this weapon. You can minimize the casualties and so on, because you have better items, stealth systems. You allow sudden strike, an opportunity. Oh yeah, this is the guy I'm looking for. Let's kill him right now. You have a direct hit and somehow, and so on. And I want to put this idea to the test, because I don't think it's true, actually, to some extent. But there is some basis to that, but if you push this idea more and more, you question it, and you realize that it quickly shows strong limits. So first of all, drones, what are they? New options, new markets, but without new norms, and somehow that's part of the issue. And I'm going to build on what Maaike said on that very quickly. So do armed drones revolutionize warfare? Well, not really, partially, but nothing is really new. You can go back in history and find other way to do things and so on. And are they better, worse, or just a different option for airstrike mainly? Better, worse, different for sure. Better or worse? Well, it remains to be seen. But what you have to keep in mind, if what we have seen so far is the use of drone on the battlefield in very specific conditions, mainly the conditions of the global war on terror and the theaters of the global war on terror, conditions when there is no air defense, so you have total superiority, if not supremacy, in the air by the one operating the drones, and you operate the drones without feeling threatening by any defense capabilities from your opponent. So it became a very attractive option in the concept of the global war on terror, and mainly in the context of asymmetric warfare somehow. So it's a new market also. You have some strong reluctance to share part of this technology, and you select the partners you want to share this technology with. You have the USA and Israel being the leaders, and you have the necessity for other countries to catch up with this new technology, mainly by acquisition somehow, but also by developing your own programs and own production capabilities. And you have also prospects for security markets. I mean, Mr. De Decker talked about other federal activities. Well, maybe you want to, you know, some coastal surveillance and so on. We can use drone for that, not armed, but you want also to monitor riots, something like that. Well, you can do that, and you can also think about using armed drone, these same drones, into insurrectional context, like, or very difficult and criminalized, where criminals are highly equipped with weapons, like in Brazil or in some societies like that in Colombia and so on. So you can think about that. And you have discussion of regulation. How do we regulate it? And this also this notion in the community of NGOs that if you start to think about the regulation of arms drone as being the more sensible option, you create the risk, or you engage into a narrative that you do legitimize the use of armed drones already, because you create a distinction between what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and you're trying to engage this way. So you have the, let's say, extreme option when you just deny the right of armed drones to exist, and then you try to identify the situation, the cases when you can use or cannot use the drone. And same applies to the market, to where you can buy, you can sell drones, and in well-out conditions where you cannot sell drones, arms drones. So there are a lot of work to be done on that. But drones, you know, this illusion of good kill. The good kill is, the terms is from the military, and obviously a bit provocative for civilian. You have the clear identification of the target, your stealth, you have the sudden strike, and the terrorist is not killed but incapacitated. Okay, fine. But what we witnessed is along the global war on terror and the use of drones, there has been a lot of work done and very, very impressive work done by NGOs to calculate, record the casualties of arms drones, numbers of operation, confirmation of this operation, confirmations of total kill, enemies, civilian, and somehow they have been able to identify children with that. And yeah, I'm sorry to say, you have more than between 100 and 200 and 2,000 people, civilians that have been killed by a drone, only civilian, and you have a number of children now between 300 and probably 500 now that have been killed by armed drones. So these are called unfortunate kill or more officially collateral damages. But why? How come? I mean, it's so specific, it provides so much better intel. Well, maybe your intel is biased only by the sensors or the understanding you can have some from them. Maybe you have a bad situation of the bad understanding of the situation of the ground because the distance is too far and your sensor is not operating as well as you expect. Maybe you underestimate the civilian casualties because you cannot see everything from where you are. You will need some kind of triangulation or confirmation, but you cannot have it because you rely on the principle of opportunity. You know that the bad guy is over there, but you cannot see everything from your perspective. That is top down, basically. And you have also to think that maybe to some extent you are making an illegal cost benefits calculation, and you put in the balance the value of the target and the risk of unfortunate casualties. I'm not saying it's happening. I'm saying that's something you should have in mind when you do things like that. Why? Because it has always been the case with the military. Strategic bombing, well, where there's some strategic assets, very specific strategic targets in addressed. Do we need the need to bomb Tokyo with incendiary bombs or things like that? This is the thing the military has always done for some good or bad reason, depending where you put your level of acceptance about that. And Maaike said a lot of things that I totally agree with. You should pay attention to not encourage a confusion between drones and autonomous weapons, except it's a bit too late for that. And maybe it's not absolutely necessary to deal with this distinction. Why? Because when I started to work on drones, we were talking about that just before the seminar. People were talking about autonomy as a concept, and the meaning was, how long can you keep that thing up in the air? 6 years later, autonomy was not about that. It's about what the software can do by itself, and how much I can delegate to the software, and how much the interface, the human-machine interface, can allow me to do things, or the system to do things by itself. It's totally changed. And this discussion about drones and this mobilization of the civil society and also the United Nations, they clearly see or foresee very quickly that there was an issue with drones if you start to think about the possibility to apply artificial intelligence technologies to these systems. So that was a first step towards that. And in this slide, I think it's important to recall that all the debate we have on drones at the moment is also with the fear of what artificial intelligence can do if you apply it to a weapon system. And you also say you should pay attention to categorize drones and the type of drones. That's very true. But when it comes to arms control, well, you have to talk about the technologies, the system by itself, the subsystems, and this is what you want to control. And no matter the size or the length or the wingspans of the drone and so on, the technology will be more or less the same, and you have to categorize it this way. So when it comes to arms control, you have to find a definition that would fit for almost all of the drones. And when it comes to arms control, you are facing a major issue because drones, okay, it's a platform, but mainly it's a software, sensor, software, and platform. And software When it comes to arms control, it's a blind spot. We have no visibility about what is happening with software when it comes to arms transfers and how it circulates between the provider of the weapon system and the client and the end user. It's purely rely on what the state wants to share about that. The state, the provider system and its clients somehow. A part of that, well, there's no monitoring that can be done on software. And there was a lot of things. I mean, this is a case when we talk about drones on the perspective of applying artificial intelligence technologies to these systems. Well, you have a case for disarmament and/or limitation or regulation, but how would you do that? Well, how would you decide, okay, this is the kind of use internationally that is allowed with an armed drone, and this is the other kind of use that you cannot allow with the armed drone. That's going to be very difficult to do it at the national level. So if you transpose this reflection at the United Nations, well, even at the European Union, we have we add a code of conduct. We now we have a common position, and you have 27 understanding of every other words in these things. That will be definitely a challenge to be able to do something like that. There was something that we should not count misuse. I think it's you, Lode, who misuse as an argument against the use of arms drones. Well, history says otherwise. Not only the crossbow, but strategic bombing, what can be done with a bomber, what can be done with a mud fighter. Is it allowed for a battleship to bomb coastal village or things like that? Well, at the moment, the international community, the laws of war decided this is an unacceptable behavior. This is a total misuse of this kind of weapon. And this is where the international community will draw a line and consider this is a crime. So misuse of drones, sorry, it should be, and it must be, and has to be an argument, as it has always been for any kind of weapon in history and any kind of project of building new norms to limit the misbehavior or misuse.
Yeah, but I was not saying that it is not an argument. I was saying that it's not decisive argument.
It's not a decisive, but it's not an argument. And is it decisive or not? Well, it's part of a framework, so that should be taken into account. But as I said before you jump on me and say, yeah, this is not what I say, I want to emphasize on where I disagree with what you say, just to allow debate. And the term disagree is a little bit too strong because I clearly understood what you wanted to say about that. So, armed drone, are they just another tool? Yes, to some extent. They are dealing with risks that we are very familiar with as NGOs, people engaged to arms control and building new norms and so on. The military also, they are quite familiar with some of the operation you can do with drones. It's another way of doing them. But the scope of the intel, the risk of biased information, and the fact you base the decision only on sensor and a kind of human interface machine, that's something different, because you have human intelligence on board on a FX-16 and you don't have that on a drone. The nature of the target also, terrorists mainly in the global war on terror, well, it creates a challenge to establish a clear distinction on who is a fighting force and who is just a civilian. And let's be clear, if I'm a terrorist and the terrorist group are behaving this way, if you want to blur you have to blur the line between who is a civilian and who is a terrorist. So you have all the interest to remain even within the population to at least create a doubt on can I fire or not with the guy that is operating the drones. And sadly, with the amount of casualties, well, sometimes you have to consider the possibilities that the operator decided too bad. The guy is too precious target, and I have to fire. And then you have to anticipate when you have new technologies, what are the various applications of these technologies, not only in the context of the global war on terror, but Can you think about using it on the global war, the war on drugs? Well, it already happened a couple of times. The war on crime, is it only from the most advanced countries like the United States, France, Germany, maybe Belgium, or maybe not, because you have people developing these technologies now in South Africa. You have highly ambitious arms production project in Saudi Arabia. Well, can we really expect that all these countries will use the same rules of engagement as Germany? Not sure.
Yannick?
Yeah, and I'm going to finish that very quickly. So after 15 years, what is the impact for the civilian population? It's very difficult to measure it. I don't know. And it's very different, a different perspective from if you're living in the Western society or if you're living on one of the society where the global war on terror is fought at the moment. So then, what are the danger for the civilian population? Well, the danger, it's the terrorist group has all the interest to blur the line more and more and more again between the fighting force and the civilians. And does the use of drone lower the threshold or not of the use of force? I don't know, because you lower comparing to what? This is where drones is another kind of option, a new option. It's not an F-16. You will not do what you do with armed drones with an F-16. Most of the case, you cannot do that because first you will hear the F-16, you will see it, and it will not be stealth enough, and it will not be create the same opportunities. It's very difficult. You have some kind of mission, or you can imagine that, okay, this could be quite close, but it's not still the same. So the way, the operation that you can do with armed drones are specific enough to be distinct enough for what can be done with other type of air system. Thank you. I've been a little bit too long. Sorry. I want to open the way to questions.
Thank you, Yannick. Then I guess it's time to open the floor for questions. I saw that in the Q&A there have been some questions asked, and I'll start with the first one, which I guess is has partly been answered by Yannick just now in his presentation, but I would like to hear from Maaike what she would react to it. Is the distinction between autonomous weapons and drones likely to remain in the future, particularly as more autonomous technologies are developed for drones and also developments in drone swarms?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's totally right what the question is hinting at, that these are going into a similar direction. I just wanted to make this statement because sometimes, yeah, the debates about the two often get mixed up, or people are applying the arguments on one sort of weapon on the other. And so I just wanted to make the conceptual difference clear, like that people don't criticize drones because they have wrong ideas about their level of autonomy. But it is very correct that drones see more and more autonomous functions, especially in the next generations of drones. As I mentioned, drones are quite weak, for instance, against air defense systems. So in the context, especially of more great power competition, if more symmetrical warfare is more and more on the horizon, more advanced drones that can operate, in communications denied environments, for instance, or fighter aircraft that can launch drones or fly in loyal wingman configurations together with a fighter aircraft, or as you mentioned, the swarms, although those are still quite a while, quite a bit in the future, but there's definitely a lot of interest in these. So we're totally seeing more and more AI in drones, and we're then not only talking about AI in the targeting, but also AI in communication between devices, in mobility. So we're definitely moving into that direction in the future. But at this current point in time, it is we can't really call the SkyGuardian-drones autonomous weapons, and that's more of the point that I wanted to make clear, that if we want to specifically talk about the SkyGuardians, we should keep that debate separate. If we want to talk about drones and the future of war in general, then of course it's a very relevant angle to keep in mind.
Thank you for that answer. I see a question for Mr. De Decker from Laurie. She's asking, in your intervention, you stated that the Belgian military had a very different information position in the missions in Libya than it had in Iraq. Is this statement supported by the number of civilian casualties that fell during Belgian military actions in both Libya and Iraq and Syria? In other words, were there more civilian casualties in Libya as a result of Belgian airstrikes or Belgian strikes than there were in the fight against ISIS? So I guess because there were less drones, as you said before, in Libya to collect intelligence. Your microphone is still muted, yes.
Thank you for that question. First of all, I have to state that both in Libya, or neither in Libya nor in Iraq, we had any reports of civilian casualties as a result of Belgian interventions. And that is one of the things that we pride ourselves on. You're never 100% sure, but we do everything possible to avoid making civilian casualties. One of the reasons why we have a red card holder team who is monitoring all the engagements. But what you do have is that with drones, with more drones, you have more different sources of information where you can build your picture on, leading to a quicker decision process. And that is key in every war, I would say, in the art of war, is that you have to be quicker and able to decide quicker than your enemy does. And so if you have to wait for intelligence, like in Libya, where most of the intelligence came from people on the ground via different means, so it took a while before you had the information. Sometimes it was too late, and so you couldn't intervene, and you had to wait for another opportunity. If you have more drones, you'll have almost real-time monitoring of what is happening on the ground, and that combined with the sources on the ground will give you a better picture, and you can act quicker. But the number of civilian casualties hasn't been different in between, at least not for Belgium, in the different conflicts.
Thank you for that reaction. Then a question I think Yannick would be able to help us with. Jack is saying that in the recent weeks, or in the recent week in the Netherlands, there have been a lot of calls for more drones to increase intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance capabilities, and thereby more precise strikes to limit civilian harm. Yet we know from many human rights NGOs, such as Reprieve, that the US is operating with a vast drone fleet that killed over 1,000 civilians while trying to strike just 41 targets. So surely the logic of more eyes in the sky reduces civilian casualties needs to be tested or challenged.
Yeah, but as I say, you compare this claim to lower the casualties to what alternative? I mean, traditional bombing or a strike for a fighter, it's okay, lower than what? That's very, very difficult. I agree that you improve the intel. If you use drone, you have another way of doing things, but you have also very specific missions now that you can apply to drones, and you can, it would be very difficult to imagine that you will build the same operation with the same purpose without thinking of the capabilities of the drone by itself. You have to do that. I mean, that's a common sense. If you say, okay, I'm this village, you have this guy, I have this drone in the area, I can cover so much space, it will be stealthier than an airplane maybe, and the airplane will create some difficulties when you operate it somehow. Well, you built your mission from the beginning with the idea that this is a drone that is going to strike over there. So it's not lowering the casualties comparing to another type of operation. Is you will deal with the aftermath of your decision to fire or not. Will they create casualties? The fact is they do create unexpected or unwanted casualties. We have strong report with that. It is lower than something else? Well, not really, and because it's a mission for the drone by itself.
Okay, thank you. Maybe I would also be interested to hear a reaction from Mr. De Decker on this question. I think it's interesting for the Belgian defense as well.
Yeah, well, of course, it's to be seen how you use the drone. If you use it as an intelligence collecting platform, then you can loiter a longer time and you can build intelligence. At the moment that you use it for engagement, for kinetic engagement, yeah, that is the end of a decision chain where you put all the intelligence together and you decide to engage. Whether that is solely based on what the drone has seen, most of the time not. It is also in a headquarters that it is decided that this target or a certain target does now merit to be engaged, or it is now the moment to be engaged because it becomes dangerous, or it is actually engaged in hostile activities. And so even when you use a drone to engage kinetically, it will be a process with different intelligence streams. Most care will be taken to avoid civilian casualties, whether it's an F-16 or it's a drone or it's something else or it's a missile. The outcome is, as stated before, unknown. You do your best to prevent it, but whether it's a drone or an F-16, that will not differ in the outcome of the engagement.
Thank you for that reaction. I see a question by Jeroen in the chat. I think Lode would be able to help us with the question is, one possible moral ethical aspect of RPAS is a standoff distance between the operator in home base and the operation theater. So I guess where the conflict is going on or where the engagement is taking place. Is this a factor that should play in determining whether or not an armed or unmanned system should be allowed to be used?
I don't see the question. Where is it in the Q&A box?
It's in the chat. If you,
Chat.
it's yeah, the fourth last question. But so I guess the distance between the person who is deciding to let's say pull the trigger or to engage and the conflict region or the place where the engagement will take place, should this play as a factor in deciding an unmanned armed system should be allowed to be used?
Well, I don't see a moral argument against a big distance between the one using the drone and the battlefield, or the victim on the other hand.
Well, one could argue there is an unequal position between both of them. It is harder to protect yourself from a drone than to protect yourself from a person that is in front of you, for example.
Yeah, but if that's an argument, then you should also argue against airplanes.
So for you, it is not an argument enough for...
No.
Okay.
For me, neither. Actually.
But at the same time, I believe that it is at an emotional or psychological point. I believe that it is disturbing. That, of course, is very important to acknowledge. That it's disturbing for civilians to see drones and to risk the possibility that you will be killed or harmed by a drone, and that is something different as being harmed by an airplane, a helicopter, or whatever. I see the disturbance, I see the difference, but at the moral level, if you would like to use that as an argument, I would say that's not an argument, even though it's a psychological difference. And it is related to, I touched upon it at the beginning of in the middle of my presentation. And I believe that for some people, the distance is an argument, since they relate the distance with the idea of respect. So as long there is some physical proximity between the soldier and the victim, or the one who attacks and then the one who will be killed, that there is some kind of respect or whatever. So this kind of argument is appealing to my intuition, but I would say that's it's completely irrelevant. Why would a soldier who is in only 500 meters or 100 meters or 10 meters from you be more respectful than a soldier who is sitting in a small cabin, and in some small room somewhere in the desert in the United States or whatever? How would that be more respectful?
I see that Jeroen is happy with your reply, but it makes me think as well of an article that I recently read in the Dutch news website, The Correspondent, where the journalist cited US Special Forces who compared drone warfare with mowing a lawn. It seems easy and effective, but it has one big disadvantage: the grass always grows back. And with that, they meant that by using drones, it fed the anger, the fear, the despair with local populations, and from that, new enemies were born time and time again. And we see that in all conflicts where drones are being used for years already, they have never ended the conflicts. So I'm curious to see what your reactions to that would be.
My reaction?
I can
Yeah.
say.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, but I agree with that, because you use the drones, but that's also a result of or maybe an adaptation of the behavior of the terrorist group to the use of drones. You have to hide within the population, and you have to create the condition where the strike is unacceptable, and will create some strong recriminations against the operator of the drones, and legitimized your cause between or among the population you are hiding in. So that's the difficulties of using drones in the context of the global war on terror, and trying to identify people that don't wear uniforms. That if you have a list of legitimate targets, you need to have a clear identification. It's very difficult, and these people would not just go in a place when there is no one else and please shoot me now. They will do everything they can to create this kind of situation. If they are the best thing that could happen to them with that dance is that deaths will come with other people around, and it will increase the support to the group and delegitimize the one that operates the drones, and try to win this war on terror this way. So sadly, this is one of the ways the terrorist group adapted to the situation.
And Merel, one of your points in your reaction was that a drone never ended the war. Yeah, that's true, but that's also true for a gun. I never saw the first thing. Second thing, if the civilians were disturbed and anxious because of the use of drones, well, I can imagine that a lot of civilians was also disturbed by seeing all those other kind of machine guns, etc., etc. So I see maybe distinctions, but not in the sense that they would be relevant to argue against it.
Yeah, well, the main distinction, I think, is that drones can reach further and in more remote areas. So they reach places they have never reached before.
The machine gun, you can see it, you can see where it was, you can see where the fire is coming from. So the drone is totally unexpected for the population.
Yeah, okay.
But if it's all right, I'll go to the next question. We have 5 more minutes. So I would say time for 2 more questions. I see one here for Mr. De Decker. Again, from Wim, who is wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on the capacity of the MQ-9B to collect data on battlefields and in other military operations, and about sharing this data with allies that might be using them for targeting under other rules of engagement. What is Belgium's position on data sharing from drone operations? And secondly, what would be decisive for Belgium to consider arming their drones?
Interesting questions. First of all, the MQ-9B, as stated, is modular, so we can load different sensors. It can be full motion video, it can be radar, it can sense signals. So depending on what we are being asked or what the situation on the ground is, we would tailor to the mission or even do combinations of those. A more interesting question is, of course, what would we do with that data? As said, most of the time, we engage together with a coalition, which means that we bring something to the table in the coalition and we take and we use all the things that are on the table. So if we gather information that would be made available to the rest of the coalition. Now, what is done with that information? That depends a little bit on the end user, I would say. Most of the time, the packs of rules of engagement of the different partners in the coalition are more or less aligned because there is an objective which is common to everybody and that is set out in the mandate. If there would be small differences, and that would be the role of the red card holder, because he holds a red card, so he can say yes or no. It hasn't been done with the intelligence so far. But it could be that that there would be a red line where Belgium states that, okay, intelligence we gather with this platform cannot be used for. That is foreseeable and that can be decided by the politicians. When would we foresee arming a drone? Not for the near future, I would think, but that would depend on the situation on the ground. The advantage we have with the drone is, for now, its reach and its loitering time. If you start mounting weapons underneath, you reduce those two strong points. So as long as we have aircraft available, we would use our aircraft predominantly and leave the drone loitering so that we can gather more information. But if our aircraft, we don't have any aircraft anymore, or we would decide to engage or to participate in a conflict only with drones, then it would be up to the politicians to decide whether or not we would add a kinetic option to that drone. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you for the clarification. And then lastly, I see that Maaike would like to answer the last question, which comes from Anami. And she's asking if drones will become something in reach of every individual or group, thus creating an endless source of everyday danger, uncontrollable by public powers. I assume states.
Yeah, I just wanted to say a few words here on the proliferation of drones, because it's a very interesting question. But when we have to then distinguish again between very different types of drones. So the male drones, like the SkyGuardian, I mean, when we started about 20 years ago, they were only really in the hands of the US and then into other Western powers. Now the cat is out of the bag, so to say. China has them especially. Russia's working on them, and China is selling their armed drones as well to their allies there for much cheaper than US drones, which also more I'm looking for the right word, restrictive in its drones exports. However, it doesn't mean that everybody and their mom can use these drones. They're still expensive. They require infrastructure, thinking about communication links, runways, GPS, etc. These tactical drones I mentioned, those are really the main proliferator. We see those in every military you can think of is adopting these smaller tactical drones. And then the small commercially available drones, in theory, those would indeed be available for all. But here you also have to realize that, I mean, it's easier to just place a bomb somewhere if you want to use them. I mean, the advantage of using a drone, if you're a terrorist, there's the strong psychological effect. But in essence, the risk is not so much in the availability of drones. And then there's also a lot of research going on counter-drone technology, both within more civilian law enforcement angle and from a military angle. There's research ongoing into using nets against drones, munitions, microwave technology, jamming, even I think like the Dutch did it, training eagles to take down drones, but it didn't really work, but it looked very nice. Great pictures. So you also have to take that into account. Counter drone technology is also a very big source of interest and rising. So that has to be part of the picture where we talk about the proliferation of drones.
I can add something to that very quickly.
Yes,
When you talk about new technologies, and drones are not necessarily very new now, the first feeling from even soldiers or the public in general is to overestimate the space to which it would spread, or to which it would be reliable enough to be used on the battlefield. This takes a lot of time. So at the moment, the number of operator of armed drones on the battlefield, I mean, they're not that much. You can think about Israel, you can think about the US, a couple of very close allied country to the US, maybe Russia and China, and that's it. I mean, if you think about a couple of years back or 10 years back, everyone is working on drones. I mean, the idea is something that can fly up in the air with a camera on it, and you can do some kind of recognition. Okay, that's the basic understanding of drones. But the military drones, with the level of maturity and how reliable it has to be used on the battlefield, that's totally something else. And if you try to project yourself in the future, I mean, artificial intelligence is very difficult to understand and to see what is exactly artificial intelligence, how it will be implemented on some platforms, and what you can do with some platforms. That's also something else, but do not overestimate the pace of implementation of these new technologies and how fast it will spread within the armies all over the world. It takes a lot more time than expected.
Thank you, Yannick, for this concluding remark. So I think then it's a good thing that we're talking about this tonight, about the political, legal, ethical concerns and implications of arming drones and of using them in military conflicts. Thank you to all the speakers tonight for making time and for your expertise and for wanting to speak on the panel. I would also like to thank all the attendees, everybody who joined us. I hope you found it an interesting discussion, and you got something, some more information from it. And we will be writing a little article about tonight. You can find it on the website of Vrede, VZW, and on our website, Pax Christi Vlaanderen. And for the rest, I hope you'll have a good night, and hope to see you soon on the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.